Chapter 21. This is an interesting chapter. It kind of opens up a lot of questions. And as I was looking at some of these things, when you read through it and when the questions do come to your mind, sometimes it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense why events unfolded as they did. And I don't know if I'm going to be able to, with any justice, bring any good conclusions or good answers to some of the questions that at least I had been able to come up with, and or at least that I was challenged with. And we're going to take a look at about a lot of that this morning before we begin the lesson. But we are in chapter 21, and this is the vengeance of Gibeon and the Philistine wars that David fought. Now, I can't remember if David Kratz in his books made the comment that we're not sure if these chain of events actually happened after the rebellion of Sheba, or if these were events that the person that chronicled his events just added to the end of the chapter. It seems like chapter 22 is one of those chapters that may have happened earlier in David's life. I don't really know, nobody really knows. When you look at the commentators or the people that comment on this, some go one way, some go the other way, and some of them just kind of take the middle road and say they just don't know. And I'm, I guess for the sake of this class, I'm just going to say these events happened after the time of the rebellion of Sheba. We do know that it happened after the time that David took Mephibosheth under his wing, so to speak, and gave him a place at his table. So it happened after those events. So at least we do know that whatever time frame these do fall into, these events did happen. We've got a lot of people in this context. When we look at those that are concerning the famine and the retribution of the Gibeonites, we of course always see David, but we have mention of Saul and Armani and Mephibosheth. And this Mephibosheth is a son of Rizpah, and so is Armani, which was Saul's concubine. Then we see the 5 sons of Adriel, the son of Barzillai, and who was the Olethite. And these are those who Michael raised. Now there was another, this is another one of those situations that, she didn't have any children, and Adriel was married to her sister, so what was what was the connection here? And I tend to think that her sister bore the sons, and at one point in her life may have passed, and Adriel, for one reason or another, had her sister raise the children for him. Maybe that he was a warrior, wasn't home, and needed someone to take care of the kids, so he probably requested that she do that. Again, we just don't know, but I'm kind of thinking that might be the case. Then we have the Gibeonites, and then we have mention of Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, and then we have mention of Jonathan, which was the son of Saul, and then Kish, which was Saul's father. So all of these kind of play a part to some extent in concerning the famine. Now, when we get to the end of the chapter where it talks about the Philistine wars, evidently these were additional wars that happened, I guess, when they started seeing David having issues and civil wars within the nation. They began to think this is a good time for us to attack David again and see if we can overthrow him and take vengeance on what he's done to us. So again, we see David, Abishai, which was the son of Zeruiah. Here we go with some of these words again. Sibechai, the Hushathite, Elhanan, the son of Jared Oregim, the Bethlehemite, and Jonathan, the son of Shimei, which was David's brother. And there's no E on that, so that was a typographical error. Now, concerning the Philistines, we see Ishbi-Benob, which was killed by Abishai. We see Seth, the brother of Goliath, the Gittite, and we see a 6-fingered giant. which was killed by Jonathan. And the locations concerning the famine, we see mentions of several places here. We see Gibeon, which was, if you remember at the beginning of our class, was where where Saul's descendants, Gibeon is where Saul's descendants were eventually hung by the Gibeonites. Beth Shan is where Saul and Jonathan were hung up after their death, as we started our lesson. And then Jabesh Gilead was where the men that valiantly went, took their bodies down and brought them back to Jabesh Gilead, and that's where they remained. And then finally at the end we see Zelah, which was the tomb of Saul's father, and this is the location where David brought all of his expired family and buried them in the tomb of his father. Now, I don't know if you can see this very well or not. I forgot to get my pointer. You know, when I put these maps together, sometimes I don't know if these names are going to show up very well on that screen, but we will see. Got it. Bethshan is where Saul and Jonathan were hung upon the wall by the Palestinians. Jabesh Gilead is where they finally wound up, and Gibeah is where his 7 descendants, 2 sons and 5 grandsons, were executed, and then finally they all wound up down here in Zelah, and this being the Dead Sea, kind of give you an idea. This is the Jordan River. So this is kind of the route that their procession took. Now, the locations of the Philistines' wars was in a place called Gob, and this is also named Gezer, and Gath was the other location. So if we were to look at that, of course, here's where the Philistine nation was at. It was kind of close to their borders. Gath was here, and Gob was up here, and in relation to Jerusalem was right over here. And I guess I need to work on my lettering. But that's kind of the location where the wars that we see in this particular chapter resides. So we get to our chapter synopsis, and when we look at it, there's only 4 or 5 things. We have the 3-year famine in Israel. Saul's descendants are executed by the Gibeonites. Rizpah mourns for her sons, and David's strength fails him, and he no longer goes to war. That's verses 15 through 17. And then the last 3 or 4 verses, we see Palestinian warriors that were defeated by David himself. And I think that's, okay, now we get to the preliminary thoughts. This is probably where I'm going to spend most of my time at, because it brought up some ideas, some questions that I had to try to answer. Now we know that the famine was caused by God. It was a 3-year famine, and when the famine happened, David inquired of the Lord, why is this happening? Why are we having a famine? You know, we may have a bad year or 2, but when it's consistently one right after the other, then we begin to question, you know, or at least David's mind questioned what's going on. So he inquired of the Lord, and the Lord answered and said, it is because of the Saul and his bloodthirsty house, because he killed the Gibeonites. Now, first thing that comes to mind is it wasn't the Gibeonites that instituted their, I guess, complaint against David. It was what's going on, and David goes to God, and God said, this is the reason why, because of what Saul had done. Now, this sets in motion of events, because if it's God's judgment upon Israel, then what happens was because of God's judgment. And we kind of question, why did he allow the execution of 7 men because of this? Is this because of the fact that they are simply descendants of Saul, or were they guilty of what had happened to the Gibeonites? Or were these just innocent men that just happened to be caught up in the course of events and didn't have any recourse but to allow their lives to be given for the sins of their father? So that was one of the questions that kind of came up, and I think maybe we might be able to make some conclusion on that in just a moment. Now, concerning Joshua's covenant with the Gibeonites, this goes back to Joshua chapter 9. And when we look at Joshua chapter 9, some things come up about this. As you know, when they were beginning to conquer the nations, or the nations round about, the Gibeonites, the Amorites, they've kind of changed their name over the years, were afraid that because of the success that they were having and knowing that God was working with Joshua, that they themselves were going to be annihilated. And to prevent that, they made themselves up look like they came from a long ways off, and they came to Joshua to make a covenant with him that they would not suffer at Joshua's hand. And so they made a covenant with them that they would not attack them, and they would, protect them. So when it finally came to light that these people were close in relationship to Joshua's attack, they came. The rulers of the nation came to Joshua and the elders, and they were mad because of the oath that they had made to them. And so Joshua, at this particular point, came to his people and wanted to know, why have you deceived me? And they said, well, we're afraid that you're going to kill us. But because of the oath that Joshua had made, he was afraid that God would bring judgment upon him and the nation if he were to break the oath that he had made. Now, we also know in Exodus chapter 34 and verse 12, God had warned them about making covenants with these people. For some reason, Joshua and the elders did not consult God about making this covenant. They did it on their own volition. So Joshua made a mistake. He had to abide by the mistake that he made, and because of the integrity of heart that he had, he did not allow the people to be destroyed. But instead, he said, you're going to be servants, you're going to be woodcutters, you're going to serve the temple, you're going to serve us for the remainder of your lives, and your descendants are going to serve us. And they were more than happy to do that, just to keep from being annihilated as a nation. So that was the covenant that Joshua had made and had been in place for several hundred years. And the promise was to protect them and do them no harm, and they would serve Joshua in servitude, or at least serve the nation of Israel in servitude. Joshua cursed them, made them slaves. They would never be free. Now, the Gibeonites knew about, when we go back to the time of David, the Gibeonites knew about the promises of God that was made. That the land would be conquered and all the heavens would be destroyed. Let's see. Let's go to the next one. Now, they knew all of this, from history, that, they had this covenant with the nation of Israel. They would not be harmed. But Saul broke that covenant. Now, when it said that over in chapter 21, because he killed the Gibeonites, when Saul and his bloodthirsty house killed the Gibeonites, Saul broke that covenant with Joshua, between Joshua and the Gibeonites. Now, there's no single event that was covered in the Old Testament relating to a genocidal war against these people. Either it was not recorded, or it may be events that happened throughout Saul's life, that he tried to, at various points, deal with these people. Now, we do know that Saul was guilty of genocide in his anger. When he got mad, he wiped everything out. One of the instances that we're told about is the priest and the inhabitants of Nob in 1 Samuel chapter 22, verses 16 through 20. When Saul got angry, he killed not only the priest, but he killed the men, the women, the children, the animals, everything, because of his anger of David. He just went, I don't know any other way to say it, he just went ape crazy and killed everybody. So it is evident that the covenant protection was violated by Saul and his house. We do know from his actions that when God said it was because of David and his bloodthirsty house, we can take it to the bank that he did bring his retribution against the Gibeonites for one reason or another. Now, concerning this bloodthirstiness, God has said back in Numbers chapter 35 and verse 33 that, let's see. So you shall not pollute the land where you are, for blood defiles the land, and no atonement can be made for the land for the blood that is shed on it, except the blood of him who shed it. In other words, if there is bloodletting, I guess in the most violent way, unjustified way, that the only way that it can be rectified or any kind of redemption for the land would be the shedding of the blood of the man that created the problem to begin with. In other words, Saul broke the covenant, he shed innocent blood of the Gibeonites, the land was polluted with blood, and the only retribution for that was the blood of the man that caused the problem. Now, since Saul was not alive, it fell upon his family. Now the next question is, well, we'll look at that in just a minute. Now the next question is, was his sons, get back where I want to be, was his sons and his grandsons guilty of the same crime as Saul, or were they just innocent people that got caught up in the course of events? Well, we just don't know. The Bible doesn't tell us. But let's make a little bit of assumption here for just a moment. We know that two of the men that were handed over to the Gibeonites, Amani and Mephibosheth, were sons of his concubine Rizpah, which means that they were probably around the same age as David, if you know, give or take a few years. So there's a good possibility that they were actively engaged with Saul in this slaughter of the Gibeonites. Now, what about his grandsons? The 5 men that were raised by Michal, probably the children of her sister. Were they guilty? Well, we don't know. But we do know one thing from our beginning of our study. Whenever David had the Amalekite that reported the death of Saul to David, we are told that when it came time to execute this man, that he had one of the young men of the army to do it, which means that it was probably a 16-year-old kid. And we see that even today, you know, in wars. So it could very well be that these 5 men were young, but yet they were being taught the ways of war. So we began to question, were they innocent bystanders, or were they actually in Saul's care and were being directed by Saul to make this execution? We don't know, but that's the possibility. Now it would stand to me that since the son should not bear the sins of the father, that there has to be something more to this than what just meets the eye. Because if that were the case, if the sons do not bear the sins of the father, then you know, why are they bearing the sins of their father and their grandfather? So I guess what I'm saying is that God said that Saul and his bloodthirsty house kind of drives me towards that conclusion that his sons and grandsons may have been guilty with Saul in this particular matter. Now, it had never been justified, never been brought to conclusion about, retribution being made for what Saul had done, and now God is saying, now is the time, since nobody on earth is going to make this right, I have to step in and make it right, and that's what God had done. He brought famine upon the land, it was cursed, and that curse remained until after these events were brought to a conclusion. Everybody up with me? Does that make a lot of sense? Does that kind of clarify why these events may have happened? That's kind of like one of those little rabbit trails I had to follow to be able to bring this, I guess, to some kind of straighten it out in my mind. Now, when the famine occurred and God had told David that this was the reason why, first thing David does was he calls for the Gibeonites and he spoke to them. Since they weren't the ones that brought it up, I guess, at least maybe they might have brought it up to God in prayer, we don't know. But David says in verse 3, what can I do for you to make atonement, that you may bless the inheritance of the Lord? And the Gibeonites said unto them, we don't want any silver or gold, we don't want any wealth, any monetary payment for what has happened. And we don't want you to go out and kill someone on our behalf because of what has happened to us. You're just an innocent bystander. He said, we will take care of this matter. Deliver unto us 7 people from Saul's household, and we will hang them in Gibeon of Saul on the hill before Gibeon. And Gibeon was the hometown of Saul. So it's kind of like, give us these men, we will execute him in his own town, his capital, when he was king. It was kind of like bringing Saul's sins back home to him. And he says, at least the people will know that we have taken care of this matter, and it's because of the guiltiness of Saul. He did it in the presence of his own brethren and not in some far off country. They took care of it amongst themselves. So David said, I will give it. He had no problem with delivering them up. And because of his covenant that he had made with Jonathan, we talked about this earlier, he spared Mephibosheth, and he also spared Mephibosheth's son, Micah. So David was honoring his covenant with Jonathan and preserving his house. So he took Armani, Mephibosheth, 2 sons of Rizpah, and 5 sons of Michal, whom she had brought up for Adriel, the son of Barzillai, the Mahilthite. This may be the Barzillai that we talked about in the last chapter. I don't know if that's a common name or not, but that may be the assumption. So we're probably talking about his grandsons. And if that's the case, I wonder how this may have set with him and David. So again, we just don't know if this is the same individual or not. But he delivered them into the hands of the Gibeonites. They hanged them on the hill before the Lord, and so they fell, all 7, that day. And it says they were put to death in the death of harvest in the first days of the beginning of the barley of harvest. Now they stayed hung. This kind of gruesome. They stayed in this position for about 5 months. When I looked at the time of harvest, the time of the first rains, they were saying it's probably 4 or 5 months. So it was not a pretty sight. And what made it even more heartbreaking, I guess, was the fact that Rizpah spread on the rock the sackcloth of mourning, and she kept the birds and the wild beasts off of the bodies the whole time that they were there. Thick and thin, she did her best to preserve, I guess, some kind of memory and honor of these men, even though they were not properly buried. And this was another interesting thing, because it says that if a person is hung, he should not be in that position he should not stay overnight in that position. When it comes night, they need to be taken down. And it did not happen. So I don't know why the Gibeonites didn't do it. I don't know why the descendants of Saul didn't do it, but the fact remains that they were there. And that's one of these things I just can't answer unless the people that realized what had happened just didn't want to get involved. They probably felt like these men were the scourge of God, and to do anything to them to give them any kind of proper burial may bring the retribution of God upon them. Just don't know. But they were there, and when David had found out that Rizpah was doing what she was doing, I guess at this point David took a little bit of compassion upon her and realized that, even though this was Saul, God's anointed, and his descendants, that he, in a certain amount of respect, was responsible for what had happened to these young men, or these men, and that we need justification to bring this matter to a close so that it's not constantly in the sight of Israel. We need to bring the breaking of the covenant with the Gibeonites to an end. We need to bring God's famine to an end. We need to bury these men. So what he does is he goes up to Jabesh Gilead and he collects the bones of Saul and Jonathan, and he brings them back to Zelah. And this was a town in Benjamin where his father's grave was at. Remember, Saul was a Benjaminite. So he brings Saul and Jonathan's bodies down. He takes down the 7 men that were hung, and he buries them in the tomb of Kish, his father. So this kind of brings an end to this particular event. And once they were buried, and all that was performed that the king had commanded, he said after that, God heeded the prayer for the land. So that tells me that the famine came to an end after these men were buried. Now, if they would have stayed up there for 2 years, that famine would have carried on for another 2 years. So in God's eyes, it was a covenant was broken, and you don't break covenants no matter what you do. You make a promise, keep your promise. You don't take your anger out on people for no good reason. And in this particular case, Saul was shedding blood in his anger. I guess his family followed suit. And when the matter finally came to light and retribution was made, it didn't end until these men were put into the graves. So it had to come full circle for God to finally end this famine. Kind of a gruesome event, kind of a, why did all this happen? But I think it's a matter of God looking at how we conduct ourselves with each other. If we make promises, do the best we can to keep them. Don't make covenants with the intention of breaking them. Even if it's something that maybe your father might have made to your next door neighbor. Put this fence line up and I'll help you take care of it. And you inherit the property and the fence starts falling down. Honor your father's wishes. As long as you own the property, keep the fence. Help your neighbor keep the fence up. That's making a covenant and keeping the covenant. So I think God was looking at that. Covenant breakers are not respected before God. Those that do wrong to other people is not respected for God, and that God will bring retribution if the situation is not handled among yourselves. That's what I see in this particular set of verses. Now the next part of the chapter starts detailing some wars that happened with the Philistines. And I want to say there was about 4, I have to go back and count them again, there's about 4 wars that happens. And during the first one, we see that David was fighting against the Philistines, and it says that he grew faint. Now this tells me that these particular wars happened towards the end of David's life, because David was a strong warrior, fought many battles, and won just about every one of them. And when it finally came to this one, I think it's kind of like me when I'm out trying to play with the grandsons. I can only run so far before I'm sitting there, leaning up against the wall, gasping for breath. And so we see David's age beginning to play a factor in it. And in this particular war, Ishbi-Benob would have possibly killed David if Abishai hadn't intervened. This was his nephew, David's nephew. He intervened, stopped the giant, and he killed him for David's sake. And at this time, it says the men of David swore to him, saying, "You shall go no more to battle with us, lest you quench the lamp of Israel." In other words, as long as we're here, we're going to keep you in the castle in Jerusalem. He says, "You're not going to come out here and create problems for us." He goes, if you think you can fight these people, we're going to have to take good men away from the heat of the battle to protect you from getting hurt because you're too old to fight, and that's not good for the battle itself. And the second thing is that what David had done for Israel, uniting the nation, bringing them to the prominence that they had, and the greatness and glory of the nation for God, he said, you are not going to find yourself in a position of getting killed, because if you do, that's going to bring the biggest amount of despair in this nation. If David dies, what are we going to do? And that will do more harm than anything that's ever happened to us. So I'm assuming at this particular point in time, he kind of wised up and stayed away from the battles. That particular war was won, and then it happened afterward in verse 18, that a battle began with the Philistines at Gibeon. Then we start seeing which Israelite killed which giant. And then it says, again, there was war at Gibeon with the Philistines. Elhanan, the son of Jairi, or Oregim, the Bethlehemite, killed the brother of Goliath, the Gittite. Now, I'm not sure if this was the same, how old this brother was when Goliath had died. He was probably a pretty old man, even by David's stature. So, I'm not sure how old he was or when he was born, but he was the brother of Goliath, and he met his end in war. And then he says, yet again, there was war at Gath. This was the other city that was to the south of God. He says, a great man of great stature who had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in number, and he was also born to the giant. Now, that phrase, also born to the giant, we don't know who he's referring to. It may be that this could have been Goliath's son, again fighting for the glory of Palestine, hoping to destroy David in memory of his father. We don't know. But he was born to the giant, and he defiled, so when he defiled Israel, Jonathan, the son of Shimei, David's brother, killed him. And I think this is the first time that we see mention of Jonathan, David's, I guess it would be a nephew from his brother, in battle. These 4 were born to the giant in Gath and fell by the hand of David and by the hand of his servants. So we see the uprising of the Palestinians, and these were giant men. And I think Goliath was, about 8 or 9 feet tall? 9 foot? Okay, he was 9 foot tall, so that's a pretty good sized guy. Sometimes they say, the bigger they are, the harder they fall, but sometimes the bigger they are, the harder they are to maneuver. And so they probably fell easily in battle once they got close enough to be struck. So the wars were won by the nation of Israel, and David's kingdom continued at this particular time. So it's kind of an interesting chapter. Makes us think a little bit about the course of events, and hopefully what I brought out kind of helps you understand some of the things that may have been the root cause of this famine. Any questions or comments? Anything you would like to bring up that I might have missed? Yes, ma'am.
There's, there could be confusion about Mephibosheth. There's 2 of them. One being the son of Saul, and I guess the one that David was protecting, the grandson of Saul. But at a moment's notice, when you first read it, it sounds like they're the same person, but they're not.
Right. Verse 8 says that Armani and Mephibosheth, the 2 sons of Rizpah. And this was a different individual. I guess it was a popular name back then, like Tom and Ted. Anyway, anything else? Did that kind of clarify some of the questions you guys might have had about the famine? It also shows us a little bit about the nature of God. You know, the people, as we've seen within this book, and if you go back and look at 1 Samuel, if you go back and look at the Judges and Joshua, even in the Pentateuch, you see that mankind was, they had a hard life, and they lived hard. And those that were actively engaged in warfare, life was immaterial to them. It was, just as common as any everyday thing. To slay someone out of anger or out of malice, that it was nothing to them. And we see a lot of that even today. A lot of people said the end of the world is because you're going to hear about wars and rumors of wars. Well, there's never been a time in man's history that there has not been a war being waged upon this earth. And I'm convinced that it will be like that until the day of the coming of the Lord. Now, one thing that kind of struck me, and it kind of like another little rabbit trail I followed. We live in the United States. We've got a lot of freedoms. And I guess as far as the United States is concerned, I wouldn't want to live anyplace else. I've been to a few other countries and glad to be back to America. But the United States is not exonerated as being, this great, wonderful place. And I say this because one thing that came to my mind was, at the beginning, at the foundation of the nation, the concept of the Constitution was put together by some brilliant men. They had great ideas and they put them down on paper and put them in practice. Problem was, the people that followed them didn't think too much of its validity. As man began to move westward, they had the problems of the Indian nations. And I had read that in one particular year, that they had made something like 370 something treaties with various Indian tribes. And 18 of those treaties were violated by the United States. And when the men went out there and made these treaties with the American natives, the natives signed these things off in good faith that they were going to be kept by the United States government. So when these men went back to Washington, they looked at it and Congress said, we're not going to ratify this. So in their minds, it was not a valid treaty. But the men that were sitting there with the Indians made it a valid treaty. And so we start seeing covenants being made that were being violated. And, I hate to say it, those poor guys took the wrong end, got the wrong end of the deal. But whoever is in charge of running the government sometimes is not always the people that are mindful of treaties that are made and covenants that should be kept. If they would have kept all the treaties that were made out in the field, I think this country would look quite different from today. So, just want to say, there is no perfect government, no perfect country, and I think we need to be aware that whatever we do as individuals, we need to respect God's commands. Thank you for your time and your attention.